So, interestingly, a common theme coming through, emotional intelligence, certainty, uncertainty, the narrative, the insecurity that I talked about, which is really how lots of hatreds manifest themselves. Is it that we're having a confluence of a whole series of major changes, whether it's the external threat of climate change making people think, is this worth it? Is it the management challenges which seem to be constantly churned? Or the lack of a national narrative delivered through Parliament where it reconciles some, because there's no doubt for those of us that worked in the 80s, Mrs. Thatcher had a narrative. She knew where she was going to go, and the people who were going with her believed that they were on the right side, they were going to win. And they weren't running so far ahead. I like your sort of 3 steps forward, but the ability to take 1 back or 2 back. She was actually very good at that in a way that history will increasingly recognise, and managed a lot of these things. Claire, you work with groups of people. I was thinking earlier on of sort of one of the major industries like hauliers and others. A lot of them independent practitioners or small firms. And I know some people who work in that area myself. They must find this very emotionally draining. When you mention certainty, how do you try and give them a sense that there is a bottom or a base to their industry and that they can do some planning rather than freeze?
Yeah, I mean, it won't surprise the room to know that, business sentiment is not in a particularly happy place. I think, I do quite a lot of travelling around the country meeting chamber members, and there have been a few events where, people are absolutely beyond frustrated. And I was speaking to a business from Scotland actually yesterday who knew what certainty meant. So we've been calling for certainty, and that's the right thing to do, but in regards to a no-deal Brexit for her or a messy, disorderly Brexit for her, she knew that her export business and what the tariffs in that regard would be, and that would send her under. And I think that is a very difficult place to go. What I've always been surprised about, and is sort of the ability of business and others facing very difficult challenges to find another way through. So her way through was to ask her chamber if there was anything nationally that we could do, and obviously we are now advocating on her behalf around that specific tariff code, which is very detailed but incredibly important for her. I also think that there is a lot of things that businesses are making decisions in terms of trying to find the right thing for their bottom line. So one of the things that we've seen repeatedly over and over again, and we've warned of publicly, is that businesses are making decisions that are right for them. They're acting within the ways that they can. And so as the Brexit process goes on, they're stockpiling, or they are moving operations overseas, or they are making other arrangements or other legal arrangements. And I think overwhelmingly what we see is that people try and find a way forward. And that is absolutely right, but it's the right thing for their business, not the right thing for the UK economy. So I think overwhelmingly we know that they will find a way forward. But it is very difficult when you have those personal stories, and I take them very seriously. Kent fruit farmers last year really didn't understand what the immigration processes are and how that would affect. And they were an excellent employer that had lots of repeat business because people like to work for them. So there are ways forward, but it is very, very hard.
Neil, the health service is not one homogenous group. There are very diverse experiences. I mean, I look at the huge changes that mental health has been through, reversing out of the big asylums and stuff, and then trying to meet society's anxieties, and just facing an absolute wall of change and demand. I mean, how do you speak to all those kind of different audiences that you have, and whether it's employees who come from overseas or people that are working in an area like mental health, where Actually, that can be quite different from the experience of people in a big acute hospital.
Well, yes, they are, and the health service is a vast industry all by itself, and some of the bits within it are huge. I mean, so running an acute hospital can be a 1.2, 1.4 billion pound operation. So these are not little things. On the other hand, you might have a single-handed general practitioner who's running a relatively small business. So there is that whole variety of challenges. The challenge of demand, funnily enough, is almost universally felt across the healthcare system, not just our healthcare system. It's true of every developed and indeed developing country around the world. And the amount that countries devote to healthcare has gone up very steadily. One of our problems now is that we've basically paid for this increase in demand over the years by probably not meeting that demand in some ways, but secondly by default falls in defence expenditure and less money on housing. Those are the two fundamentally, and we've kind of run out of road on both of them. So there is a question about, we've also contributed more as well, but there's a huge challenge, I think, facing the industry about how does it get more effective and more efficient, as it were, in order to be able to achieve that. So there are all those kind of things. In a way, I'd say those are, I mean, for the health system, that's business as usual. What's not business as usual is some of the more existential things that you've been talking about. And I think those anxieties around the existential business, whether it is climate change or the future of the country and so on, I think they're very fundamental. Alongside that is the uncertainty around technology. And John made the point about the slowness of technology to come in. And funnily enough, the healthcare industry has a pretty mixed record on this, frankly. Tony Blair said in the year 2000 that he thought that one of the big challenges with the then NHS plan was that the health service was not embracing computer or whatever the word was at that time. There is still a problem in terms of the speed with which you embrace the bit of future that is there. And I think that's enormously difficult. The challenge, again, and it is more existential, it's about how you go about doing things, is that we're not really clear about how far technology will change what it is that people do. So traditionally, technology has got rid of lower level work. As AI starts to come in, will it actually start to change what we want the most highly qualified, the doctor? Now already, for example, there are machines that will read scans and so forth, and will be able to spot things that even the most advanced clinician would not have been able to do. So there are a whole series of things, and I think these things cause anxiety around the whole system. I don't believe we're any time soon going to need fewer doctors. We're desperately short of them. We're even more short of nurses. But there definitely is a challenge about what it is that we use this staff to do in different ways. And Brexit is just another. It's just such a layer of uncertainty. It may be short term and we take the pain, and if we go out and it is very difficult, in a way, however difficult that is, at least people will say, I've landed here and I know where we are, even if we're starting to come to terms with it. I think we're in the worst position now where people just haven't a clue what's going to happen.
You mean they want to get to a point where they can say things can only get better?
Exactly.
Let's open it up to... Let's take some questions from the floor, and we've got a microphone. If you could just say who you are and ask a question or contribution on what you've heard. Who would like to have a shot? Don't be slow in coming forward, or I'll ask you. Okay, at the back. You just say who you are and what you do.
I run an organisation that deals with the transformation of the machinery of government, whether that's health or business or whatever. I'm really taken by the issue of certainty and uncertainty. And that was particularly highlighted by our two speakers who have members. And it's really crucial what you have to be able to offer to members at times of great uncertainty. Certainty means confidence. That can be acted upon. Uncertainty means if you're going to act, you have to trust. Trust in uncertainty. So I'd like to ask the two who are in the middle of this storm, in those terms, where does trust lie for action to take place in the midst of such great uncertainty?
Go on, Claire, you first.
Well, I mean, actually, I think I would go back to one of Niall's comments. I think it is always about personal relationships. And I think that we have to remember, whatever our views and however potentially frustrated that members might feel or other, the people that we are working with, trying to drive forward change, are people. And I don't know if any of you saw the Ed Balls documentaries where he went out and he did a kind of tour around the US and met a whole range of different people. And I was fascinated by that because I think it was absolutely clear that no matter what, there is always connection between people, and that is how you build trust. And we have been working with all political parties in the last year, having very difficult conversations. But we have been able to build trust, and that is because we have recognised that they are people. And I never want to be in a situation where I'm too busy to speak to a business, I'm too busy to speak to a member. That is absolutely what I should be doing. So I believe it is how you act, but I also think whatever someone's view, they are a person. And I think that one of the interesting outcomes from, just as a commentator around Parliament, has been that people have shifted things slightly. So you see people who have made relationships and formed sort of working groups across parties and across different places. I think that's immensely powerful. I would be doesn't mean that it's necessarily led to a solution. I will fully accept that and have repeated things. But I think there's something really interesting that actually we are now moving to a place where we accept that actually it's about building relations with people that perhaps you wouldn't talk to. And if there is one good outcome, is that is something that we have seen in Parliament with people cooperating in different ways. So that hasn't led to a solution. We need much more of that. But I think we have to start with people, and that's how you build trust.
Neil?
So, I mean, as a membership organisation, I think the first thing you must not do is over-promise. And be as honest and frank with your members as you can be, both about what you can do, what you can't do, and that you listen to them, exactly as Claire has just said. I think the wider issue of trust is very fundamental, though, and there is a danger that, like people always say that doctors' morale is the lowest it's ever been, and they've certainly been saying that for the last 35 years I've been involved in this business, and each year it's worse. So it must have got to Australia by now in terms of medical morale. But so there's a danger of saying trust in the political system and certainly I remember studied politics in the 1970s, and there was talk about trust in the political system was declining. Having said that, I genuinely believe that something has happened. Parliamentary democracy has come up against populist referenda. And you see it in Scotland, it doesn't be solved by whatever the referenda result is. And again, we've seen it again with Brexit. And the collision of that and the way in which it corrodes political conversation and so forth. Now, maybe the political establishment needed a shake-up anyway, these old parties and the coalitions they represented. I'm not trying to defend that as a status quo, but there's something very fundamental about having a representative democratic system and then abutting it with a one-off, right, wrong, whatever, which I think has had the effect of further undermining a system in which deference was already on the way out anyway, so the political system had to find new ways of engaging There's a new generation coming that is already starting to communicate in very different ways and thinking about different ways. But I think this has been another existential challenge. And I think that trust will be very difficult to rebuild. I mean, there are lots of things like whether it's expensive scandals and all sorts of things that are symptoms rather than the fundamentals. But that fundamental issue about trust in authority, and I think it applies to those of us who held public office, and the kind of the lack of trust which currently exists, and fighting to retain that trust, I've certainly experienced that myself, is a real issue. And you mentioned social media, the kind of stuff that's written in social media, the things that are attributed to you, the things you've allegedly done or said or thought, it means that I think we have degraded some of that conversation. So how we rebuild that, I think, is a real challenge.
I should say I couldn't get a Vice-Chancellor to come on the panel today. John, both you and I worked in politics where trust wasn't something that was just won. It had to be disciplined and fought for. And it seems to me that a lot of that discipline is broken down. The narrative was that, you know, there were tremendous rows and fights between political parties, but there was a common objective to try and enable public management to prosper and cope with change, to enable private management to prosper and cope with change. But at the moment, politics seems to be prepared to disrupt both, which is, you know, my accusation on year zero thinking. We can tear things up if we want to. What's your feeling about that breakdown in discipline, and where do you think a new narrative can come from?
So the 2001 was the last decisive election in UK politics. It was the last election with both a large majority and the governing party having over 40% of the vote in UK politics. 2005 was a fluke, a 60-seat majority, but Labour on 36-37% in the polls. So in reality, the public have made their choice. The public have chosen to fragment their allegiances, so they're not served. There's market failure, and the market failures in politics. The biggest underserved grouping of people are probably moderate Remainers and moderate Leavers, both of whom respect each other's points of view. Moderate Remainers probably don't think we should leave, like I don't, but probably don't think we should disrupt democracy and ignore a referendum, however misguided that was. Actually, a referendum is asymmetrical. When the status quo wins, the other guys get to come again and again until they can win. And when the status quo loses, it's winner takes all. That's the nature of a referendum. We went into it in the wrong way. But it's a symptom. The public are, in one sense, horizontally, the political field is fragmented. There's a desire and an attempt in Scotland and in England to arrange politics on a vertical around two poles, yes or no, independence or staying in the UK, leave or remain. And you can see an entire strategy pitched on that fell apart last week, which was the notion that you can bring all the Leave voters together because you calculate, one, you overestimate the stupidity of the Leader of the Opposition massively. That was a miscalculation. And you overestimate the extent to which voters want to be herded. 12% of voters want to vote for the Brexit Party. And the Brexit Party are the emotional Trotskyists of the right. And for them, Boris will never get their votes because becoming Prime Minister was the first betrayal. Boris betrayed the Brexit Party voters when he became Prime Minister, just as Tony Blair betrayed the left when he won an election. How do we know Tony Blair is a Tory? Because he won an election. Victory is the first betrayal in the Labour Party. It's absolutely, it is. And I think, in a way it goes to the question that Bill raised about certainty and uncertainty. And it touches on a bit of what both Neil and Claire have been saying. To some extent, we're living with the consequences of a huge success. What do I mean by that? We've massively expanded higher education, so the consequence of it is we don't simply have a bunch of voters who are always on social media and Googling and going into the doctor with a complaint they've just discovered. We've actually got, when I went to university, 10% of the young people went to university. Now when 30 to 40% have been to university and rising, it's not just that they're not deferential anymore. They're on average, the average voter is at least as well informed and at least as clever as the average MP. Now, that is bound to lead to some system changes and some system problems. I sometimes try to think of it in this way, which is the Industrial Revolution produced an industrial economy. The industrial economy produces hierarchical organizations. That's its nature. Command and control really works in industry. And if machines break, you replace the machine. If workers break, you replace them with an alternative workforce. We don't live in an industrial economy anymore. We live in a network economy, and network organizations are horizontal, not vertical. Remember when the fuel duty strike happened back in the early part of the Blair government? Tony wanted to find out who he could negotiate with, and it turned out it was a leaderless dispute led by people communicating on mobile phones. There was nobody to talk to. There were hauliers, they were independent contractors, and they were texting each other to work out how to organize this thing. It was a crisis of the just-in-time economy, because you can close an economy quickly, and a crisis of the very first network-organized insurgency. And in a way, that was the beginning of what we've been seeing working its way out through Brexit and the Brexit Party. The new forms of social organization are going to require, at the very least, new forms of political engagement. And one of the very funniest things of last week, and it's gallows humor to some extent, I suppose, but to hear Philip Hammond, the former Chancellor and now former member of the Tory party, on the radio forced everyone going, it's my party. I'm going to stay, I'm going to fight, I'm not going to let them take over my party. That could have been me talking about Jeremy Corbyn. In fact, it was almost a direct quote from me about Jeremy Corbyn. That's the other crisis is internal. The organisations have got an internal crisis, which is that the leaders of the parties come from factions to the edges of their own parties. And so, will there be the imposition of a narrative? I don't think the solution is narrative. I think the solution is leadership. And I think your reference to Margaret Thatcher was well made. I'm just reviewing a book about 79 to 82. For Dominic Sandbrook has written a book about 79 to 82, which is really when the modern world we live in was created by Margaret Thatcher. It stops before the miners' strike, but in a way, it's a riposte to the Andy Beckett and the Guardian School of Journalism, which is, weren't the 70s great? And the answer is no, they weren't. I lived through them. They were terrible. Rescued by punk, but they were terrible. And it gets you to, like, what was Britain like in 1979? I've just reviewed Steve Richards' book on Prime Minister since Wilson. And the answer is, from the mid-1960s to the early 80s, people believed that the union problem in Britain was insoluble. And then it was solved. Because it could be solved. I remember meeting a politics professor friend of mine who said, teaching politics in Sheffield University at the time in the mid-80s, late 80s, he said it's really, really weird teaching it, because you try and teach the 70s and the 60s and the Donovan Commission and Place of Strife and the Industrial Relations Act, and people go, why did Prime Ministers take such a long time to work out what they should do, which is just break the unions? And that's the thing, we're at the moment, we're at the edge of it's a paradigm shift as much, an existential threat will create a paradigm shift. There will be a political leader, and some political leadership or a movement, which finds the answer, and part of our problem is, and look, I know this deeply, I'm part of a very old generation, so I'm certain that I will recognize it when I see what the solution is. I'm not going to come up with it myself. This is for a younger generation to come up with the solution. But in every area that we have, I think we have got some of the least competitive business in the world, and we don't have a political party that stands for competitive market capitalism. We've got a political party that stands for rent seeking. We've got if Grenfell was anything apart from a tragedy, a terrible tragedy, it was the end of the purchaser-provider split. It was the end of the new public management. It was a visible crisis of the new public management. That's over. But nobody's got an alternative to purchaser-provider and hard contracting and all those things. Our institutions are built around them. So we've got a set of interlocking, related, parallel, mirroring crises, which in the end, when we look back in 15 years' time, we'll go, that was so obvious. Why didn't we think of it? Because the Thatcher solution is, in retrospect, so obvious, or as Ronald Reagan used to say, it's simple, but it's not easy.
Okay, final word, Neil?
Well, I mean, I think it's very interesting because I was having a debate earlier today about what used to be called the purchaser-provider split within the health service. And funnily enough, there is the beginnings of trying to work out how you move into a post-simple purchaser-provider split. But there are all sorts of dangers attached to it. And one of the dangers is you don't have any grit in the oyster and you simply hand over a bunch of money to some of my members, I'm sure, who will look after it very well. But I think there's a recognition within the system that you do need some grit within that oyster, and how we move away from a very mechanical procurement system, which clearly has not done what it was meant to do, and is in some form of crisis. So just to respond to that point, I mean, I think this kind of discussion ticks a whole series of areas which I think our members are facing as anybody who's holding public office at the moment. I think what we have to hope is that the crisis in the political system, as opposed to the day-to-day business as usual argument, that we do get over that over the next 6 to 9 months. And I'm hopeful that if we can get over that, then we'll maybe move towards some of the solutions that John hasn't got for us yet. But I think that we do need to get over this next period of time. And I would not underestimate the strain. Obviously, people who are running their own small business are facing, or even their large business. And certainly people who are running public institutions are finding that they are under enormous strain at the moment. And I think that anything we can do to help and support them to try and get through that process, importantly, because what they do will affect the people that they work for and the services that they provide. And I think there's no doubt that the anxiety meter is very high in anybody who's holding leadership positions at the moment.
I would concur, and I would also say that I think it would be very fascinating to look back in a decade's time or 15 years' time at this period and wonder where we could have been if we had moved to a negotiated solution much quicker. You know, there is so much wasted time, and there are so many things that could be done. And actually, you know, that is the thing that I wonder for us looking back. It's fascinating to hear insights on Thatcher and Blair, and what are other nations doing while we're tying ourselves in knots of this, and there will be some businesses that will use this opportunity to innovate. But many others are just treading water. And so I think we know that people will find resilience, we know people will find a way through, but we shouldn't ever underestimate that we are living in extraordinary times and support them in the way that we can.
Okay, can I ask you to thank our speakers in the normal way for what has been fascinating? And I'll leave you with one thought on John's point about the new networked world of individuals. It's whether or not those Uber drivers and deliverers should join the TUC or the BCC. Who's going to organise the network and who's going to develop the methods to meet them? And perhaps that'll solve the future. So thank you all very much for your time, and good night.